The flashing blue lights cut through my living room blinds like a blade. I hadn't even touched my coffee when pounding fists rattled my front door. I opened it to find two officers on my porch, their hands resting near their holsters, and just beyond them, standing like a conquering queen, was Karen, the HOA president, who treated every driveway like her kingdom and every neighbor like her subject. Her smirk was smug enough to make my blood pressure spike, and with her shrill voice that carried across the block, she declared, "We've had enough of the noise and the nuisance. That motorcycle is being removed today." I stepped out onto the porch, my boots hitting the concrete with the same thud as my heartbeat. My Harley sat gleaming in the driveway, a machine I'd rebuilt bolt by bolt with my own hands, a legacy I refused to let anyone take. Removed? On what grounds? I asked, my voice calm but razor sharp. The officers glanced at each other, uncomfortable. "We received a complaint that this property is in violation of HOA code. Excessive noise. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Possible safety hazard. Possible safety hazard." I barked out a laugh. "That bike is registered, insured, and cleaner than half the cars on this street. The only hazard here is her." I pointed straight at Karen, who puffed her chest like a cat caught in a spotlight, but still desperate to hiss. She snapped back. "The bylaws clearly state no motorcycles may be stored in driveways overnight. It ruins the aesthetic of our community. I warned you, and now the police are here to enforce it." My jaw tightened. I'd heard enough. This wasn't about aesthetics or noise, this was about power. Karen had been waiting for an opportunity to make an example of me, and she thought my Harley would be the hill to bury me on. But she hadn't counted on one thing. I had spent the last month gathering evidence, not just of her harassment, but of her entire pattern of abuse. And the folder sitting on my kitchen table wasn't for a lawyer. It was for someone far more dangerous to her little empire. I told the officers to wait and walked back inside, my hands steady even though adrenaline surged through me. When I returned, I wasn't holding keys or excuses. I held a manila folder stamped with the seal of the state attorney's office. I opened it right there on the hood of the cruiser, letting the crisp papers speak louder than my voice. "This isn't about a motorcycle," I said, my words cutting through the night air. "This is about an HOA president abusing her authority, falsifying complaints, and harassing homeowners. I have evidence of fraudulent fines, misuse of HOA funds, and now she's wasting police resources. And in case you're wondering, the state attorney has already been briefed." The officers froze, their hands leaving their belts. Karen's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing as if she could burn the papers into ash with sheer hatred. "You're bluffing," she spat, but her voice cracked, betraying her. That's when the twist hit. A third car rolled up, not another cruiser, but a black sedan. Out stepped Mr. Randall, a state investigator I had met 2 weeks earlier when I finally decided to put an end to Karen's reign. He adjusted his tie, flashed his badge, and walked straight past me to the officers. "We've been monitoring this HOA president for months. Tonight was the confirmation we needed." The crowd of neighbors had gathered by now, drawn by the lights and the shouting. They gasped as Randall began reading Karen her rights, his calm voice slicing through her screams. She flailed, pointing at me, at my Harley, at the entire block. "This is a setup. He's lying." I was protecting the community, but nobody believed her anymore. Phones were out, recording every second as the woman who had terrorized us with citations and fines was suddenly the one cornered by the law. I leaned against the cruiser, watching as the queen of control unraveled, her voice shrill, her face crimson. For once, I didn't have to raise my own voice. The better weapon wasn't fists or even lawyers, it was the truth, backed by evidence and carried by someone who could actually enforce it. And as Karen's wrists were cuffed and she was guided toward the back of the sedan, the neighborhood erupted not in fear, but in applause. For the first time in years, people felt free, and the sound of it was louder than any motorcycle engine could ever be. The crowd didn't disperse right away that night. Neighbors lingered under the wash of flashing lights, whispering, filming, trading stories about fines and threats they'd endured under Karen's thumb. Some laughed nervously, others muttered curses under their breath, but all of them felt the same crackle in the air. The spell was broken. Karen wasn't untouchable anymore. For years she had ruled with her binder of citations, parading through the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, but the sight of her shoved into the back of a state investigator's car burned that image to ash. The next morning, the HOA chat group was on fire. Screenshots of the arrest flew faster than gossip in a small-town diner. Clips of her screaming as the cuffs clicked around her wrists went viral among residents. Even the ones who once defended her fell silent. By noon, a petition circulated demanding her removal as HOA president. By dinner time, it had signatures from nearly every household on the block. But Karen wasn't finished, not in her mind. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my door, hand-delivered by some HOA board member too timid to make eye contact. It was an official notice claiming my property was still in violation, that my Harley was banned, and that I owed over $2,000 in fines. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the letter in the fire pit. She was still fighting from the shadows, clinging to rules that no longer held any weight. I didn't even bother replying. Instead, I forwarded the letter to the state attorney's office. A week later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The rec hall was overflowing, people crammed into folding chairs, standing in aisles, spilling out the door. I walked in with my folder tucked under my arm, Daniel beside me, and felt 100 pairs of eyes follow us. Karen wasn't there, but her lawyer was, a slick man with a cheap suit and cheaper excuses. He tried to argue that the HOA had acted in good faith, that Karen had only been protecting community standards. But his words melted under the heat of what came next. Randall, the state investigator, stepped to the front with a stack of papers so thick it looked like a novel. He spoke evenly, methodically, laying out everything they had uncovered. Fraudulent fines, kickbacks from bogus landscaping contracts, personal expenses disguised as HOA maintenance. The money trail was long and ugly, and it all led back to Karen. Gasps rippled through the crowd as neighbors realized that the pool renovations they paid for, the park upgrades promised but never delivered, all of it had been siphoned into Karen's pocket. And then came the twist none of us expected. Randall revealed that Karen had been working with a developer, secretly negotiating to sell portions of common land for private profit. She had tried to strong-arm residents into compliance, planning to flip the neighborhood into a gated luxury community with her as the visionary leader. My Harley, my land, my defiance, they hadn't just been annoyances. They were obstacles to her bigger plan. She wasn't just petty. She was greedy. The room erupted. Shouts, accusations, raw fury. One man stood and roared. She made me tear down my shed while she was stealing from us? A mother clutched her child and whispered. That's why the playground was never finished. People who had once cowered now shook with anger, their voices no longer afraid. The board had no choice. In a unanimous vote, Karen was stripped of her presidency, her membership, and any authority in the HOA. The lawyer packed up in silence, his face pale. The neighbors filed out, buzzing with relief and rage, finally seeing the monster behind the mask. Karen's collapse didn't stop at the neighborhood gates. Within weeks, she was indicted on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of authority. I watched her trial from the back row of the courtroom, the same way she once watched me from her lawn with a smug smirk. But this time, she wasn't the one in control. She sat hunched, hair disheveled, hands wringing in her lap as witness after witness stood to testify. The evidence was overwhelming, and every word drove her deeper into the hole she had dug herself. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, the judge's gavel fell like thunder. Karen's wail echoed through the courtroom, a desperate cry from a woman who had built her life on intimidation and lies, now stripped of every ounce of power. She was sentenced to years of probation, restitution payments, and community service. Ironically, the same community she had terrorized was now the one she was forced to clean up under court order. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. Watching her shuffle out in handcuffs, shoulders sagging, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I felt freedom for me, for my neighbors, for every person who had ever been bullied into silence. Life changed after that. The HOA reorganized, this time with real transparency. Meetings became discussions instead of battlegrounds. Neighbors started waving again, helping each other with fences, sharing tools. And me? I rode my Harley down the cul-de-sac every evening. The engine's roar no longer a symbol of defiance, but of resilience. Kids waved, parents smiled, and the noise Karen once despised became the soundtrack of a neighborhood finally alive again. The wooden board I hung by my garage still bears the words I painted that night. My bike, my right. It's not just a sign, Anna Marie, it's a reminder that no matter how loud the bullies shout, the truth can roar louder. That sometimes the best weapon isn't fists or lawyers, but the courage to gather the evidence, stand your ground, and let justice do the rest. So I leave you with this. Was I right to fight back the way I did, to call in the state attorney instead of just moving my Harley and keeping quiet? Or should I have taken a different path? Tell me what you think, because stories like this aren't just mine. They belong to all of us who've ever stood our ground against the Karens of the world.